All right, guys, welcome to the next video. In this tutorial, or in this video, we're focusing solely on working with services and creating our Stripe service. We've already created our controllers, and so we could put our services in our controllers. However, you don't really want to. We could put the service code inside our controller functions, but you don't want your controllers to do or have a lot of lines of code in the functions. And so that's why we're focusing on creating our own service. So let's go to app and let's go to creating a directory. We'll call this services. And we'll create the directory Stripe. And we're going to have three services, our three own custom services that we have to make. All right. So the first service that we're going to create is we're going to create a customer service. And in that customer service, we are going to have a static method called save, public static function save. And we want to have in our parameters, we want to have a user. And we also want to have a credit card. So it's going to be an array. And so at the top of the service, we want to set our API key for Stripe. Oops, wrong thing. Oh, I forgot to get all the composer packages necessary in the initial config and migrations video. So we're just going to do that right now. So the composer files that we're going to need are going to be composer Stripe and then Stripe PHP. Oh, whoops, composer require Stripe PHP. All right, that's downloading. And we're going to have another file or another composer package that we're going to have to import. I'm just going to pause the video while that's installing, though. All right, so the Stripe package has installed. So the next package we're going to want to install is Guzzle, which is just the HTTP client that we use. And so composer require Guzzle HTTP and then Guzzle. Oh, whoops, wrong word. Dang it, require, not required. All right, so that's installing. But in the meantime, we can just start working on the save function that we want to make. So we're going to, at the top of the function, we're going to set our Stripe API key. Set API key. And if we remember, we can just use the config helper method. So in our services file, we can access the Stripe array, and then we want to access secret. And the next thing we want to do is we want to create a Stripe token. So token, that imports the Stripe token class. We want to create, and we want to add our card into that create parameter. All right. And so the next thing we want to do is we want to create a Stripe customer. And so since we're already using the customer of the class name customer in this file, we're going to have to import the full namespace. So customer is equal to namespace Stripe, namespace, and then the actual class customer. And we want to create a user. And so the source is going to be our token ID, token, and then access the ID. And then in our email, we want to, or in the email parameter, we want to add the user email. Since it's going to be a user, we can just say user email. user email. And then we want to update our user. And we want to say, okay, let's update their Stripe customer ID. And we do that by saying user update and then customer ID. And so it's as simple as that. So we've already created our customer service. So in the customer controller, we're going to want to go back to the controllers, customer controller, and we want to say we want to create the customer via our service. So we can import that customer. Make sure you're importing the services and not importing the customer class from the services that we created and not from Stripe itself. So let's import that. And we want to save the customer, and we do that by adding a user in the first parameter, and we want to add our card in the second parameter. And it's going to say expected app user, but got like if you're using PH form, got a different class. And don't worry about that. Our app user actually extends authenticatable, so no issues there. It's just a annoying message from the IDE, so don't worry about that. And we can erase we can erase or delete the comment that we created over here. All right, so our customer controller is actually fully complete now. The next service that we want to create is we're going to want to create the seller. And so we do that by saying, let's create a class seller. And this is going to be a bit different. We're not actually going to be using Stripe. We're going to be using the Guzzle HTTP client since we're using OAuth to create a Stripe Express account. So we'll say, let's create our static function called create, public static function create. And it's going to take in a request, or it's going to take in the code from Stripe. And that's going to be passed via query parameter. Because I did talk about that in the previous video, when you're redirected back to our application, Stripe adds into the query parameter a few fields of its own. It adds in the state field, and it adds the state field to identify the user, of course, and then it adds in the code, the temporary code to create a Stripe Express account. So in that parameter, we're taking in the code. So the first thing we want to do is we want to import the Guzzle client. New Guzzle. That's not right. Poser require. Let's see if we can use. All right, here we go. So new client. And our base URL is going to be the Stripe OAuth URL. And so that's kind of how that's set up. Next thing we want to do is we want to create a request to that URI. And we'll say client request. The method that we're going to use is the post method. And the actual route itself is going to be token. And then we're going to want to pass in some parameters or some data. And that data is going to be form parameters. So we're going to pass in our client secret. If we remember, we can just access that by using the config helper method, services dot stripe dot secret. And the next field we want to have is we want to have our code, which Stripe uses to grant access to that Express account. So code. And then lastly, the grant type, which will be authorization code. Authorization code. All right, so we want to return this data. It's going to be JSON data, so we're going to want to decode that to use native PHP code. So we'll say decode request get body, and then get the contents of that body. All right. So our our seller method or our seller service is actually created, and so now we can go to our seller controller and we can create the other methods that we need to create in that seller controller. So we already have the create method there, which redirects them to Stripe. The next thing we want to have is we want to actually save the user. We want to be able to save the user. So we're going to say public function save. It's going to take in a request, and we want to validate that request. It's going to have two variables in the query string. So those two variables are going to be code, which is required. We will require, and state, which is also required. So as I mentioned earlier, if the user might not be logged in if they're redirected, and so that's where state comes into play. And so we can identify a user by using that state, and the state just uses the session ID from the backend database. So the way we can access that is we can say, let's create session. We can use the database facade. We can grab the table sessions, and then we want to say where, since we're using the session ID for the state variable, we can just say where ID is equal to the request state. And then we want to get the first ID. And so we just want to validate that just in case somebody's trying to hard code that or something like that. So if session does not exist or if it's null, return redirect to the product route and say products, and let's say there's going to be an error. State not found. All right. And so if we do find that user, we can just say, create the seller account. So what we'll do is we're going to access that service that we created. And we're going to call this data. And we're going to create a seller using that service as I mentioned, create the create method. And we're going to pass in the request code, which will then return the JSON data, or not JSON data, but it's going to be an object, a PHP object. And so from there, we're going to update our user Stripe Connect ID. So let's find our user. So find user based off of their session user ID. And update Stripe Connect ID using data Stripe user ID. All right, and so return a redirect back to the products page saying, hey, it was successful. We'll say account information has been saved. All right, so that's our save method, and so that's just we only use the create and save when a user does not have a Connect ID, a Stripe Connect ID, and so yeah. But if they do have a Stripe Connect ID, we want to redirect them to the Stripe, their own Stripe Express dashboard, and we do that by let's create a method in our controller, call it login. And we want to access our user by using auth user and using the Stripe. We're going to want to set our, since Since the code's set to a minimum, we don't need to create a separate service for redirecting to the Stripe dashboard. We can just do it in the controller since the code is minuscule. So we'll just say Stripe, set the API key. We'll say config services.stripe.secret. And then we want to create an account link. So account create login link, user Stripe connect ID. All right, so that just redirects. It's going to create a login link that we can then redirect the user to the Stripe dashboard to see, their basic funds, or if they needed to change any of their bank information, they can do that from the Stripe dashboard. So return account link and then URL. And so yeah, that is that. And so that is our full seller controller is actually complete now. And so lastly, the last thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a transaction service, which happens when, so this is the actual, this is the most critical piece of the tutorial. It's teaching you how the funds are going to be dispersed. So when a user buys a product from our website or our platform, we handle that transaction. So we take in the charge, and then after we take in the funds, we then disperse the funds by creating a transfer to that seller account, and we transfer the amount subtracted our collected fees, and that will then be sent to their Express account. And so we just keep the difference between the amount we send them and the initial amount of what the product costs. So we're going to create the transaction service real quick. Call it transaction. All right. And so we're going to create a static method called create. And it's going to take in two parameters. It's going to take in a user, and it's going to take in a product. All right, so our initial data that we want is we're going to have the amount from the product price, and we're going to have the payout amount. So here you can just define your fee. So if you're taking a 10% fee, then you can just apply the amount by 0.9. That's just basically saying, hey, we're taking a 10% fee, and you keep the remaining 90%, and that's what you're doing for your seller. So that's the initial data. So the first thing we want to do after we created the initial data is we want to create a Stripe charge from the customer purchase. I'll just comment that here. If I can spell purchase. Let's say charge is equal to charge create. And actually, I forgot something in the initial data. At the top of the file, of course, we're going to want to set our API key. Otherwise, we're going to get an error. So set API key, config, services.stripe.secret. All right, and go back to our charge. All right, so there's that. And we're actually going to create a helper, another method in this file. We're just going to call it to Stripe format. And since we're using a static method, we got to create another static method to access that. So a public static function to Stripe format. I mean, we could just multiply by 100, but that it's not as easy to follow. It's something you can just accidentally skip over if you're running into bugs. So we'll just create an actual method for it. So it's just going to take in a float. It's going to be an amount, and we're just going to return amount times 100. And that's just basically because Stripe, it uses, it doesn't use doubles, it uses full integer values. So $1 is equal to, I believe, 1,000, not 1,000 pennies, but 100 pennies. So it uses pennies instead of the amount of dollars. So that's why we have to multiply it by 100. All right, so if you have $1, it's 100 pennies. So yeah, that's kind of how that works. So going back to our charge, we'll say the amount is going to be to the Stripe format, the product amount. We'll say currency is US dollars. The source oh, that's not right. Not source, but customer is going to be, if I can spell customer right, user Stripe customer ID. And then lastly, the description, which is going to call it the product name. Product name. All right. So we just created a charge. So this is sent to the platform's Stripe dashboard. And so the next step that we want to do is we want to create a transfer, which is then the amount sent to the seller after we collect our fees. So we'll say pay funds to seller. We'll just create a comment over here with platform fees extracted. All right, so let's create a transfer real quick. We'll say transfer create. So the amount is going to be it's going to be the payout amount. So remember, we said we want to keep 10% of we're gonna have a 10% service fee, and so we're just multiplying it by 90%, 0.9, which is 90%. And so yeah, we're going to use the payout rather than the amount. So let's change it to the Stripe format, payout. The currency is going to be US dollars as well. And then the source transaction, which is just being able to track where the charge came from, or the charge relationship, or we can just say charge ID. All right, and then the destination is going to be the seller's Connect account. So product seller. Because if you remember, we created a relationship with the product. So a product the product belongs to a seller, so we can just access that by doing product seller, and then that's the seller right here. The seller is a user model, so we can just say Stripe Connect ID. All right. And so now that we have created our Stripe transactions, now we just want to document that those transactions to our own database. So we'll just say save transaction to database, and we do that by creating payment is equal to new payment. Say payment, customer ID is equal to the user's ID. The product ID is just going to be the product ID. Product ID. And the Stripe chart, or the charge ID of the payment, is going to be the charge ID, of course. So charge ID is equal to charge error ID. And then the amount paid out is going to be payment paid out is equal to payout. And then the fees collected will just be amount subtracted by the payout. So that's your profit right there. And then we're going to save this payment. All right, so that will get saved to the database. So those are all of our services that we use, and this is the most important part of this tutorial series. This is what I really wanted to teach about. So if you're following along, I can't express this enough. So what's happening is we're creating a charge. And so that charge, the funds earned from that charge are sent to our platform. Our platform then creates a transaction on the behalf of a seller and sends them the paid out amount that they earned after we've collected our service fee. And then we document that transaction, both of those transactions, to the database. We just save the information that we need to know into our database. And so that's that's what's happening in this transaction. And so if we go to our product controller and we go back to that comment up here in the purchase, you see we can just put transaction create. And the first thing we want to have is we're going to want to put our user in here, and we're going to want to put our product in here. And again, we're going to get that little annoying warning just saying expected a user class but got authenticatable. And remember, our user extends the authenticatable, so we're fine. It's just the IDE, just being the IDE. So yeah, so that's our services. This is so far the longest video that we've had in the tutorial series so far, but it makes sense since this is probably the most important part of the tutorial, teaching you how the flow of funds are being dispersed. So yeah, in the next video, we're going to create the views and create the routes as well. And then after that video, I think we should have the middleware stuff, and then we should be able to start demonstrating the application. So yeah, all right, take care.